Hi there folks, and welcome back to the channel. Now in today's video I'll be covering everything you need to know about the 42.10.0 update for Project Zomboid that was dropped on June 30th. I'll be condensing things down to the bits you need to know, aiming to make things a bit more digestible for all you lovely people at home. This update was a relatively small one going by recent standards, but there are still some nifty new features in here that you'll want to know about. Oh, and hey, if you find yourself watching my updates on a regular basis, maybe think about subscribing. It's a huge help to me, and only 16% of the people that watch my videos are actually subscribed, so I think it's time we try and turn those numbers around a little bit. Anyway, let's start off with the new additions from this update. We're kicking things off with what is perhaps one of the biggest quality of life changes that I've seen brought to Project Zomboid in recent months. Alongside some other more general improvements, the in-game map will now feature actual street names to help you navigate the world. For anyone that's played multiplayer or local co-op with friends, you'll know how difficult it can be to describe your current location to another player, especially if one or both of you are new to the game, and thus not particularly familiar with the points of interest. The addition of these street names should be a huge lifeline for locating your friends in multiplayer, or just helping you to remember where that vehicle was that you were hoping to return to when you found some fuel. The other improvements to the map, briefly mentioned just a moment ago, include an upgrade that ensures forests no longer fade away when zooming out, as well as some technical improvements that are aimed at increasing performance. Now, players that have been following the Thursdoids during build 41 may remember that there was a mention of an entire overhaul of the fire and smoke systems. Things have been very quiet on this front for months, possibly years now, but in this update we've seen some upgrades to the visual components of both fire and smoke effects. The developers do note that this is not the full system redesign that has been mentioned prior, but that it is still planned for a future build. I've had this mentioned in my comment section a few times in the past, asking what happened to this whole thing, so I'm glad it's been brought up again by the devs, and we've got confirmation it is still planned, but for now we'll have to make do with some improved visual effects. Moving away from the fire and over to water now, there's been some additional mechanics brought in for fishing that's aimed at making things a bit more engaging. Now, the exact quote from the patch notes is as follows: "Added fishing with spinning. Player has to reel the line from time to time in order to catch something." But what does that really mean? After some additional clarification from the developers, this new feature means that in order to catch a few specific types of fish, you will need to be actively engaged in the fishing mechanic, reeling in your line from time to time in order to create movement, which I imagine is meant to simulate a certain fishing technique known as fly fishing. But I'm far from an expert, so I can't be sure on that. You can still catch most fish simply by casting into areas with bubbles and waiting for a bite. But if you're after a particular variety, you may have to use this new fishing method. Given some more time and research from players, I'm sure we'll also be able to find out which method tends to produce the best results for the player. And before we move on, controller players will be happy to know that fishing is now supported on controllers, so you'll be able to go out on those camping trips by the lake in search of that big catch, just like everyone else. For those that really like to go the extra mile when setting up their safe house, there are now additional controls available for the extended 3D placement of items. This will allow the player to not only interact with sliders or number values for the rotation of items, but also allow for interactions with the axes themselves in order to place an item exactly as you want it for that personal touch. On another note entirely, new sound effects have been added for the act of clapping and the opening of fridge doors. Some new zombie animations have been added, including new staggering animations for zombies that are pushed to the left or right, and some new animations for zombies lunging at the player and turning on the spot. Probably not something that will immediately stand out to you, but it will help make things a bit more immersive. Now, before we move on to balancing changes in this patch, there's a couple of new sandbox settings that are worth knowing about. Firstly, you will now have the option to set the length of each day to 90 minutes. And what's perhaps even more interesting is that this is now the default setting for the Apocalypse difficulty. Now, personally, I like to run 2-hour days by standard, but it's peculiar to see the default setting changed when this is essentially a matter of personal preference. preference. Regardless, it is something worth knowing about, and it's also important for me to note that this change won't affect existing save files that are on the Apocalypse difficulty preset. There is also a new sandbox setting available for zombie spawns known as Voronoi Noise. This refers to the randomization of zombie distribution that was brought in with the last patch prior to this one. If desired, players can now turn off this new distribution feature entirely, but the developers do warn that this will increase the number of zombies spawned around double the standard amount due to these zombie spawns being distributed differently with the feature disabled. Personally, I'd advise simply leaving this feature enabled unless you've experienced big problems with zombie spawns after the last patch. Okay, so we're on to some changes next, but sticking with the sandbox settings for just a little bit longer. Default Apocalypse loot settings have now been adjusted from a value of 0.4 to 0.6 for all individual loot settings, so items should be ever so slightly more plentiful than they were previously. The most important sandbox setting change though came in the form of zombie behavior. The default zombie hearing and sight settings have been changed from random to random between poor and normal, meaning that no longer will you experience those drawn out, incredibly lengthy fights with groups of zombies that just seem to keep trickling in as you continue to kill more and more of them. The experience should be a bit more reminiscent of Build 41, which in my mind is a much more enjoyable and less tedious experience with regards to this feature specifically. A fantastic adjustment that I'm very glad to see in this patch and shows the developers are listening to the majority of player feedback. Sticking with combat specific balancing changes for a moment, the M14 has now received the upgrade of piercing bullets. Now, by my understanding, that should mean that each round is capable of hitting multiple zombies from this point on, something that would undoubtedly make the weapon more widely used. However, during my testing, I took several shots at zombies lined up and found that the rounds didn't penetrate through targets as I expected them to. I'm not really sure if any actual changes have occurred here, so if anyone knows more about this, feel free to leave a comment below. In other news, and this is admittedly a very niche area that many players are unlikely to experience, players will now be able to sneak even when their feet are heavily damaged, albeit at a heavily reduced speed. Previously, this wasn't possible, which means staying out of sight significantly more difficult after damage had been sustained. Now, we're going back to zombie spawn distribution for a minute with this next one. Some of you that have played on new save files since the last update may have encountered some edge cases where zombies were spawning in much larger quantities than intended in certain locations, such as isolated cabins and police stations. These issues have now been fixed in the latest update, as well as some general balancing work to the new system, which should make for much more enjoyable and realistic zombie spawn distribution. If you've experienced some difficulties with the new system after the last update, consider giving it one more try on a new save before you go disabling the Voronoi Noise sandbox setting that we covered earlier. The building of barricades has now been moved to the building menu, so if you're a fan of using right-click actions, you might want to keep this change in mind. It's also important to note that doors must now be closed before barricades can be placed on them, and lastly, metal bar barricades now accept steel bars as a material when building them. Now, over to fashion for a moment. Some of you may remember from my last update video that balaclavas could no longer be worn with items like hoodies or helmets, which was a bit of a shame for those that enjoyed going for certain outfit combinations. Thankfully, this has now been rectified as several new alternative models have been added for certain clothing combinations. You'll now be able to wear balaclavas with helmets or hoodies like you used to, as well as bandana masks now cooperating with ponchos or padded jackets, just as another example there. Welding masks now use the no beard hair group, meaning that your facial hair won't go clipping through them anymore. The developers do note here that there are still a couple of clipping issues in this department, but nowhere near as bad as they were previously. So that's just about it in regards to balancing changes, short and sweet this time around, and it's the same case when it comes to fixes in this patch. Still quite a number of them, but I'll cover the ones you absolutely need need to know. If you want to give the list a full read, as always, there will be a link in the description to the full patch notes. Probably the biggest fixes you'll be happy to hear about in this update are to combat and interactions with zombies. For example, crawlers should now be much easier to target in combat, which was proving frustratingly difficult at times before this update. There's also been a fix to a bug that caused players' animations to freeze when being attacked by multiple zombies at once. Further improvements have been made to the relatively new and experimental zombie ragdolls. Zombies in the ragdoll state will now no longer get stuck on a ragdoll corpse, and vehicles will now no longer kill ragdolled zombies on the slightest impact. This last one does require improvement still, according to the devs, which will come in following updates. Aside from these combat and ragdoll fixes, the only other ones that are really worth knowing about is a fix for a crash that was caused when the character was sleeping, and a fix that caused some double doors to spawn extra objects when opening. Everything else on this list is relatively minimal and is likely something you've not even noticed or encountered. So a much shorter list of patch notes this time around, and a smaller update as a result, but nonetheless it needed to be covered, and a couple of things that are definitely worth putting on your radar. Once again, if you'd like to read the full patch notes, there's a link in the description, but while I've got you, we've just started a brand new multiplayer server wipe on our Patreon server a couple of days ago using the new Project France map, complete with all of the supporting mods to go with it. So if you've been thinking about joining the Patreon and supporting the channel for £3 a month, now is the perfect time to pull the trigger. Join our community and give the server a try while we're doing something different. A huge thank you, as always, to my existing patrons for their support, and if you want to join them, there is a link in the description for that as well. Thanks everyone, and I will see you all in the next one.